You're creating a disturbance! You need to come with me!
Do not touch me. You are now committing battery.
You're being detained for officer safety!
The June sun was relentless, beating down on the shimmering glass and steel of downtown Chicago, turning the city into a sprawling grid of heat and ambition. On Sterling Row, a street once defined by old money and exclusive boutiques, a new energy was taking root. It was the energy of creation, embodied by the skeletal framework of what would become the Sterling City Arts Pavilion, a soaring, audacious structure of flowing lines and public green spaces. And at the heart of that creation stood Ava Thompson. At 34, Ava was the lead architect and visionary behind the pavilion. She moved with a quiet confidence that was often mistaken for aloofness, but was, in reality, a deep, unwavering focus. Dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue blazer and charcoal slacks, she was a study in controlled elegance. Her hair was pulled back into a sophisticated knot, and her eyes, shielded by designer sunglasses, scanned the worksite with an expert's precision. She wasn't just observing, she was communicating with her creation, seeing the final, magnificent form where others saw only concrete and rebar. This project was more than a commission. It was her signature on the city's skyline, a testament to a girl from the South Side who had dreamed in blueprints and built her way to the top. A few hundred feet away, leaning against the polished granite wall of a bank, Officer Dean Holloway watched her. At 36, Holloway still had the rigid posture of his academy days, but a certain bitterness had settled into the lines around his mouth. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleamed, but his eyes held a familiar low-grade resentment. To him, this part of the city was a daily parade of the wealth and success he felt life had unfairly denied him. He saw the expensive cars, the designer suits, and felt a familiar coil of envy tighten in his gut. He was a cop, a man with a gun and the authority of the state behind him. Yet on these streets, he often felt like little more than a uniformed doorman for the city's elite. His gaze drifted from a passing Porsche to the woman standing at the edge of the construction site. He saw the expensive blazer, the confident posture, the way she commanded the attention of the foreman who approached her with a rolled-up set of plans. She didn't belong. The thought formed in his mind, unbidden and absolute. In his world, a black woman standing with such authority on this street was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order of things. It was a dissonant chord in the symphony of his prejudices. Something inside him shifted. The boredom of his patrol evaporated, replaced by a predatory focus. He saw not a professional architect inspecting her project, but an opportunity. An opportunity to assert himself, to remind this woman, and by extension, the world that had elevated her, that he was the one with the real power here. He was the one with the badge. He pushed himself off the wall, the leather of his duty belt creaking. He gave his partner, Officer Russo, a burly, older cop who was half asleep on his feet, a curt nod. "See that woman over there?" he said, his voice low and tight. "Something's not right. I'm gonna go have a word." Russo squinted in Ava's direction. "The one in the suit? She's with the construction. Looks like one of the bosses." "Maybe," Holloway said, the word laced with disbelief. "Or maybe she's casing the bank. Let's find out." He didn't wait for a reply. He began to walk toward her, his stride deliberate, his hand resting casually on the top of his holstered firearm. It was a subconscious gesture, a physical manifestation of the authority he was about to wield. He saw a target. What he couldn't see, what he was incapable of understanding, was that he was about to step on a landmine. He had just set his sights on a woman whose entire life was built on structure, precision, and an absolute refusal to have her foundations shaken. The Chicago Sun was about to witness the beginning of the worst decision of Dean Holloway's career. Ava was deep in conversation with the site foreman, discussing a complex load-bearing calculation for the pavilion's cantilevered entrance, when a shadow fell over the blueprints. She looked up, her train of thought broken. Officer Holloway stood before her, his presence an unwelcome intrusion into her professional space. He wasn't overtly aggressive, but his posture was rigid, his gaze sharp and appraising. "Can I help you, officer?" Ava asked, her tone polite but professional. She offered a small, neutral smile, assuming he was there to ask about the construction timeline or a traffic diversion. Holloway ignored her question. His eyes swept over her, from her expensive but practical leather flats to the sleek tablet she held under her arm. The look wasn't one of professional observation, it was one of suspicion, a silent judgment being rendered. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The question was blunt, the implication clear. "You don't belong here." A flicker of surprise registered behind Ava's calm exterior. She had navigated the subtle and overt racism of the architectural world for years, but the rawness of this challenge, here on her own work site, was jarring. "I'm the lead architect for this project," she stated simply, gesturing toward the rising structure behind her. "The Sterling City Arts Pavilion." Holloway's lips tightened into a faint sneer. "The architect, huh? You have some identification?" The foreman, a heavy-set man named Sal, shifted uncomfortably. "She's with us, officer. She's here every day." Holloway shot Sal a look that silenced him immediately. "I wasn't talking to you." He turned his full attention back to Ava, his gaze unwavering. "ID. Now." This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of intimidation. A cold knot began to form in Ava's stomach, but she betrayed none of it. Her career had taught her the value of composure in the face of hostility. Reaching into her blazer pocket, she retrieved a slim leather case and handed him her Illinois state driver's license and her professional license from the American Institute of Architects, which clearly stated her name, credentials, and firm. He took them and made a show of examining them for an unusually long time, holding them up to the light as if expecting them to be forgeries. He looked from her license photo back to her face, a silent accusation in his eyes. "Ava Thompson," he read aloud, drawing the name out as if it tasted strange in his mouth. "And what does an architect do out here on the street? Shouldn't you be in an office somewhere?" The condescension was thick, dripping from every word. He wasn't just questioning her presence, he was questioning her profession, her very identity. "I'm conducting a site review, officer," she replied, her voice still even. "It's a critical part of my job to ensure the plans are being executed correctly." "Right," he said, the words saturated with disbelief. He handed the licenses back to her dismissively. "You know, we've had some issues in this area. People pretending to be professionals to get access to secure sites. We have to be careful." The lie was so transparent it was insulting. There were a dozen other people on the sidewalk, tourists, businessmen, shoppers, none of whom were being subjected to a security check. It was her, and only her. She was his project for the morning. Inside, a quiet, cold fury began to solidify. She had battled for every inch of her success, overcoming institutional barriers and personal biases with sheer talent and relentless hard work. She would not be diminished by this man's petty, uniformed prejudice. He had started this interaction with a question. Now she understood it was never about getting an answer. It was about putting her in her place. Ava slid her licenses back into their case, her movements precise and deliberate. She intended to end the interaction there, to turn back to her foreman and her blueprints, signaling that his pointless inquiry was over. But Officer Holloway had no intention of letting it go. He had cracked the door open on his power trip and was now determined to kick it wide. "I'm going to need to see what's in your briefcase," he said, his voice flat and non-negotiable. He gestured toward the handsome, structured leather satchel at her feet. The request was so far beyond the pale of a legitimate stop that it momentarily took Ava's breath away. This wasn't a TSA checkpoint or a border crossing. This was a public sidewalk in downtown Chicago. "Officer," she began, her voice still calm but now edged with a new firmness. "With all due respect, you have no probable cause to search my private property." She knew the law. She wasn't just an artist of glass and steel, she was a businesswoman who understood contracts, regulations, and civil rights. Holloway's eyes narrowed. Her articulate and accurate legal assertion didn't give him pause. It angered him. He had expected fear, or perhaps angry shouting. He had not expected calm, reasoned defiance. It felt like she was correcting him, schooling him in his own profession, and his fragile ego couldn't stand it. "Ma'am, I am conducting an investigation for officer safety. I need to see what's in the bag. It's for my protection and yours." The phrase officer safety was a well-worn piece of jargon, a shield he used to justify his overreach. It was absurd. She was an unarmed woman in a blazer holding a tablet. What threat could she possibly pose? "I can assure you there is nothing in my bag that could possibly threaten your safety," she said. "It contains my laptop, my notebooks, and some personal items." "Then you won't mind me taking a look, will you?" he countered, a smug, unassailable logic in his tone. He was trapping her. If she refused, he would frame it as obstruction. If she complied, she would be submitting to his baseless authority. Around them, the life of the city continued, but a small bubble of tension had formed. Sal, the foreman, stood frozen, looking helpless. A few passers-by began to slow their pace, sensing the friction in the air. Ava made a quick, cold calculation. Arguing with him here on his terms was a losing battle. He wanted a confrontation. He wanted her to get loud, to give him a reason to escalate further, perhaps to put his hands on her. She would not give him the satisfaction. The game was on, and she was a master strategist. She would let him overplay his hand, let him build the case against himself brick by brick. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Fine," she said, her voice betraying none of the glacial rage building within her. She bent down, picked up her briefcase, and held it out. He didn't take it. Instead, he gestured dismissively toward a stone bench near the curb, away from the flow of foot traffic, but in full view of a dozen windows and the street beyond. "Over there," he commanded. "Put it on the bench." He wasn't just going to search it. He was going to make a spectacle of it. This wasn't about safety, this was about power, and he was just getting started. Ava followed his direction, her posture erect, her expression a mask of impenetrable calm. She placed her briefcase on the cool stone of the public bench. Officer Holloway stepped up beside it, his presence casting a long, dark shadow in the morning light. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't handle it with the professional care of a security official. With a rough tug, he snapped open the latches and flipped the lid back, exposing its contents to the city. The interior of the briefcase was a reflection of Ava's life, organized, efficient, and purposeful. A sleek MacBook Pro was nestled in a padded compartment. A leather-bound portfolio held sketches and notes. A small, zippered pouch contained charging cables and a portable battery. But Holloway didn't see the tools of a professional. He saw an opportunity for violation. He began pulling the items out, one by one, with a deliberate, theatrical carelessness. He removed the laptop and set it aside with a thud. He pulled out the portfolio, flipping through pages of intricate architectural drawings with a sneer, as if they were childish scribbles. Then he got to the more personal items. He unzipped a small side pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant wallet and a small silk pouch. He opened her wallet, pulling out her credit cards, her corporate Amex, and her driver's license for a second, lingering look. Then, he turned his attention to the silk pouch. Without a moment's hesitation, he turned it upside down, dumping its contents onto the cold stone next to her portfolio. A tube of expensive lipstick, a small bottle of perfume, and a pack of discreet feminine hygiene products lay exposed under the harsh, unforgiving sun. The gazes of the onlookers intensified. A woman walking her dog winced and quickly looked away. A pair of businessmen slowed, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. From a tour bus idling at the curb, a passenger raised a phone and began to record. Ava saw it all. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her face unreadable. But inside, a storm was raging. This was no longer an investigation. This was a public stripping, a calculated act of humiliation designed to remind her that no matter how successful, how poised, or how brilliant she was, a man with a badge could, on a whim, lay her bare for the world to see. He wasn't finished. He picked up her keychain. On it, alongside her car and office keys, was a small silver locket. It had been a gift from her late grandmother. He fiddled with the clasp, trying to open it. "What's in here?" he demanded, as if it could possibly contain a threat. "It's personal, officer," Ava said, her voice low and tight. His inability to open it seemed to frustrate him. He tossed the keys onto the pile with her other belongings, the metal clattering loudly on the stone. He had rummaged through her professional life and her personal effects, and he had found nothing. No weapons, no drugs, nothing even remotely suspicious. The absence of evidence didn't deter him. It only fueled his need to find something, anything to justify this gross violation. He had committed to this path, and finding nothing would make him look like a fool. And a fool was the one thing Dean Holloway could never stand to be. Having exhausted the contents of her briefcase and found nothing, Officer Holloway's frustration was palpable. His theatrical search had yielded only the mundane artifacts of a successful woman's life. He needed a win. His eyes landed on the one item he hadn't fully violated, her tablet. It lay on the bench beside her laptop, its dark screen reflecting the sky. This, he seemed to decide, was where the secrets were. He picked it up. It was a professional-grade tablet, thin but powerful, filled with the very essence of her work. It contained more than just the blueprints for the Sterling Pavilion. It held schematics for future projects, sensitive client communications, proprietary design software she had helped develop, and notes on upcoming bids that were protected by strict non-disclosure agreements. It was, in short, her brain, her career, and her company's future, all captured in a silent glass and aluminum slab. With a swipe of his thumb, he woke the screen. It lit up, displaying a lock screen with a photo of a serene lake at sunrise. "I need you to unlock this," he said, his tone no longer a request but a direct order. In that moment, he escalated his harassment from a violation of dignity to a clear and profound violation of the law. The performance of passive compliance was over. "No!" Ava said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a new weight, an absolute finality. "Officer, that device contains legally privileged and confidential corporate information. It is my intellectual property and the property of my firm. You do not have the right to access it without a warrant." Holloway let out a short, humorless laugh. "A warrant? I'm the warrant. I'll be the judge of what's privileged. Unlock it." He held it out to her, his expression a mask of arrogant certainty. He had crossed a line and he didn't care. For him, this was the ultimate expression of his power. He wasn't just searching her belongings anymore. He was attempting to invade her mind, her very intellectual property. He was treating the strategic plans of her multi-million-dollar career like a lost phone he'd found on the bus. The audacity was breathtaking. Arguing with him was pointless. He was immune to reason and the law. So she switched tactics. She reached not for the tablet, but into the pile of her belongings on the bench and retrieved her smartphone. With a few swift taps, she bypassed the lock screen with her fingerprint, opened the camera app, and hit the red record button. The small indicator light that appeared on her screen was a beacon of truth in the sea of humiliation. She raised the phone, her hand steady, and framed both Officer Holloway and her scattered possessions in the shot. The effect was instantaneous. Holloway's head snapped up, his eyes locking on the phone. The smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of anger and something else, a flicker of panic. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, taking a half-step toward her. "I am documenting this interaction," Ava replied, her voice steady and clear, a stark contrast to his rising fury. "You can't record me. Put that phone away. That's an order." "Actually, I can," Ava stated calmly, her knowledge of civil liberties, honed by years of navigating complex contracts, kicking in. "You are a public official performing your duties in a public space. I have a First Amendment right to record this." She recited the fact as if reading from a legal textbook. It was clear, concise, and indisputably correct. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a documentarian, and he was her subject. The power dynamic he had worked so hard to control had just been irrevocably upended by a lens no bigger than a pinhead. Officer Holloway was used to being in control. His uniform, his badge, his gun, they were tools that created an immediate atmosphere of intimidation. People deferred to him. They answered his questions. They complied. He was not used to being challenged with facts, and he certainly wasn't used to having the target of his harassment turn a camera on him. He took a menacing step closer, his body language screaming aggression. "I said put it away, now!" The command was louder this time, intended to be heard by the small crowd of onlookers who had now stopped to watch the unfolding drama. "No," Ava said simply. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She just kept recording, her hand as steady as the steel beams of her building. The phone was no longer just a device. It was a shield. It was a witness that couldn't be intimidated, a memory that couldn't be gaslighted. The standoff was broken by Officer Russo, Holloway's partner, who had been watching from a distance with growing unease. He could see where this was going. He had seen Holloway's temper flare up before, but never this publicly, never with someone so composed. He ambled over, placing a placating hand on Holloway's arm. "Dean, hey, take it easy, what's going on?" "She's interfering with an investigation," Holloway bit back, not taking his eyes off Ava and the damning red light of her camera. "She's refusing to comply." Russo looked at the scene, the accomplished woman in a business suit holding a phone, the bench covered in her personal and professional belongings, and his partner radiating an aura of barely controlled rage. He could see exactly what was happening, and he knew it was wrong. This wasn't an investigation. It was a shakedown. "Why'd you pick her?" Russo asked, his voice low, trying to de-escalate. "What was the initial stop?" "It was random," Holloway lied, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Russo's gaze swept across the bustling sidewalk, at the dozens of people walking by freely, none of whom had been selected for a random public search. His silence was its own form of accusation. Ava, sensing a potential, albeit weak, ally, addressed Russo directly while keeping her phone's camera trained on Holloway. "Officer," she said, her tone professional and direct, "your partner has stopped me without cause, publicly humiliated me by searching my personal belongings, and is now demanding I unlock my private, confidential work tablet. When I refused that unlawful order, I began recording him. Now he is ordering me to stop. I would like both of your badge numbers, please, and the name of your commanding officer." She delivered the speech with the precision of an architect outlining a critical structural detail. There was no hysteria, no pleading, just a cold, hard statement of facts and a demand for accountability. The words struck Holloway like a physical blow. He had lost control of the situation completely. She wasn't acting like a victim, she was acting like a plaintiff. The red light on her phone was no longer just recording, it was gathering evidence. And every second that passed, every word he spoke, was digging his hole a little bit deeper. Ava's calm, articulate demand for badge numbers and a supervisor sent a fresh wave of fury through Holloway. In his mind, she wasn't a citizen asserting her rights. She was a threat, a challenge to his authority in front of his partner and the public. He had to reassert control. He decided to use physical force. "You're creating a disturbance," he said, his voice rising in volume, a clear attempt to reframe her composure as agitation. "You need to come with me." With that, he lunged forward and grabbed her right arm, his fingers closing tightly around her forearm in an attempt to wrench the phone from her hand. The moment his fingers clamped down on her skin, the dynamics shifted irrevocably. The interaction went from a civil rights violation to a criminal assault. Ava's camera, still recording, captured the image in perfect, damning clarity. His pale, thick-fingered hand against her dark skin. It was an image of unwarranted aggression, of power abused, an image that would later be seared into the minds of millions. "Do not touch me," Ava said, her voice dropping to an icy, commanding whisper that cut through the street noise. "You are now committing battery. I do not consent to being touched. Am I under arrest?" The directness of the legal terminology seemed to momentarily stun him. He was used to dealing with people who were scared or angry, not people who could calmly narrate the crimes he was committing against them in real time. You're being detained for officer safety, he stammered, falling back on the same absurd jargon that had already failed him. Ava's eyebrow arched. Officer safety? I am an unarmed woman, standing still, holding a phone. Please articulate the specific, articulable threat I pose to your safety. He had no answer. He was flailing, improvising, and digging himself deeper with every word. He tightened his grip on her arm, his knuckles white. Officer Russo, his face now pale with alarm, stepped in more forcefully. Dean, let her go! Just let her go, man! This is a bad scene! Let's call the sergeant down here! Now! Holloway shot his partner a look of pure venom. He was in too deep. Backing down now in front of this woman, this crowd, felt like a complete surrender. It was a failure his ego, fragile and oversized, could not stomach. She's being detained for failure to comply, he announced loudly for the benefit of the audience he now felt judging him. Failure to comply with what unlawful order? Ava countered instantly, her mind sharp, her voice unwavering despite his grip. The unlawful order to stop recording you, or the unlawful order to allow you to read my private proprietary work files. A murmur went through the crowd. They were hearing her side clearly. She was laying out the legal framework of his misconduct as it happened. Trapped, Holloway couldn't arrest her without a charge that would hold up for more than 5 minutes, but he couldn't let her go without admitting defeat. You're coming with me, he gritted out, starting to pull her. Am I free to go? Ava asked, holding her ground, her feet planted firmly on the pavement. No. Then I am under arrest. On what charge? We'll figure that out when we get there, Holloway blurted out. The statement was so monumentally stupid, so legally damning, that a man in the crowd who later turned out to be a civil rights attorney actually gasped out loud. The situation had reached a dangerous stalemate. Holloway was physically restraining a woman who had committed no crime, in full view of dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras, while she calmly narrated the illegality of his actions. He was a cornered animal, and Officer Russo knew that cornered animals were unpredictable. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, I need a supervisor at Sterling and Oak. We have a situation. The call was a clear signal that Dean Holloway had lost control. The radio crackle seemed to finally break Holloway's spell of rage. He looked from his partner's worried face to the sea of phones now pointed at him, and finally back to Ava's unyielding gaze. He seemed to shrink a little, the bluster draining from him, replaced by the dawning, terrifying realization that he had gone too far. He let go of her arm as if it had suddenly become red hot. The release of his grip did not de-escalate the situation, it merely ended the physical assault. The air remained charged, thick with the unsaid and the unforgivable. Ava didn't rub her arm, though a faint red mark was already beginning to form where his fingers had squeezed. She simply kept her phone raised, the recording unbroken. It took 6 long minutes for the supervisor, Sergeant Miles Corbin, to arrive. He was a man in his late 40s with a weary face and the perpetually tired posture of someone who had seen too many of these kinds of messes. He strode up to the scene, his eyes quickly taking in the key elements. His 2 officers looking stressed, a well-dressed woman holding a phone, a pile of expensive electronics and personal items strewn across a public bench, and a crowd of about 30 onlookers. "What the hell is going on here, Holloway?" Corbin asked, his voice a low, tired rumble. "Just a routine security screening, Sarge," Holloway began, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "The suspect—" "I am not a suspect," Ava interjected coolly, her camera now pointed at the sergeant. "I am the victim of an assault. Your officer illegally detained me, searched my belongings without cause, attempted to illegally access my private work files, and then grabbed me when I refused to stop recording his misconduct." Corbin looked from Ava to Holloway, then to Russo, whose pained expression confirmed every word Ava had just said. The sergeant let out a heavy sigh. This was a public relations nightmare, and he knew it. His first priority wasn't justice, it was damage control. "All right, everyone, show's over, move along," he said, waving his hand dismissively at the crowd. A few people shuffled away, but most, now invested in the outcome, stayed put. "Holloway, help the lady pack her things," he ordered. The command was intended to sound helpful, but it was another profound insult. The man who had violated her privacy was now being told to handle her personal belongings again. "No," Ava said, the single word sharp and absolute. "He will not touch my property again. In fact, I don't want anyone to touch it. This is now a crime scene." Sergeant Corbin blinked, taken aback. "Ma'am, let's not be dramatic." "Dramatic?" Ava's voice was laced with ice. "I was just assaulted by one of your officers in broad daylight. I have a multi-million-dollar project to oversee, and I have been detained for nearly half an hour for no reason. There is nothing dramatic about my wanting to preserve the evidence of the crimes committed against me." Corbin's attempt at a quick, quiet resolution was failing spectacularly. His patience, already thin, was gone. "Ma'am, I am trying to help you here. We can put this all behind us." He lowered his voice slightly. "How about we get you a coffee, and we can all just forget this happened?" The offer of a cup of coffee was so comically inadequate, so insulting, that Ava almost laughed. It was the kind of pathetic gesture offered to someone who got a parking ticket, not to someone who had been publicly humiliated and assaulted. "A coffee?" she repeated, letting the absurdity of the offer hang in the air. "Sergeant, I don't want a coffee. I want your name and your badge number. I want Officer Holloway's full name and badge number. I want Officer Russo's full name and badge number. And I want the official contact information for the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division and the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. I am not asking. I am telling you what I require." And she was still recording. Sergeant Corbin's face tightened. The woman in front of him was not going to be placated with empty apologies and a free beverage. She was organized, articulate, and clearly understood how to navigate a bureaucracy. His posture shifted from one of weary authority to guarded defensiveness. "Look," he said, his tone becoming clipped. "Officer Holloway was doing his job. This is a high-security area. We have protocols." "Which protocol involves publicly displaying a woman's personal hygiene products, Sergeant?" Ava shot back, her gaze unwavering. "Which protocol justifies attempting to search a citizen's private work files without a warrant? Which protocol sanctions grabbing a citizen who is legally recording you?" Corbin had no good answers, so he fell back on the oldest defense in the book, blaming the victim. "If you had just cooperated from the start, none of this would have happened." "I did cooperate," Ava said, her voice rising slightly for the first time, not with anger, but with sharp, incredulous emphasis. "I cooperated when he stopped me without reason. I cooperated when he demanded my identification. I cooperated when he decided to empty my briefcase for everyone to see. I drew the line at him invading my intellectual property, and I drew the line at him putting his hands on me. Where exactly did my cooperation fail, Sergeant?" He stared at her, his jaw working silently. He was an old-school cop from an era where a uniform was a shield against questions like these. He didn't know how to deal with someone who refused to be intimidated and could dismantle his arguments with cold, hard logic. As if on cue, a man from the crowd stepped forward. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and radiated an aura of authority of his own. "I saw the whole thing, Sergeant," he said, his voice calm and clear. "Your officer's actions were entirely out of line. I'm a partner at a law firm down the street. Here's my card." He handed a business card to Ava. "I have video of the assault as well. I would be happy to serve as a witness." His action broke the dam. A woman stepped forward next. "I'm a journalism professor at Northwestern. I saw it too. He targeted her." Another man, the tourist from the bus, came up. "I've got it all on my phone from the moment he dumped her stuff out." One by one, more than a dozen people came forward, offering their names and phone numbers, creating a spontaneous network of accountability. They were no longer passive onlookers. They were a civilian phalanx, a silent jury offering a protective cordon around Ava. Holloway watched, his face ashen as the evidence against him mounted from every direction. Sergeant Corbin's attempt at a quiet resolution had backfired, creating a public spectacle with a growing list of credible witnesses. Defeated, he pulled out a notepad. He scribbled down his own information and that of Holloway and Russo, tore the page out and handed it to her. "Here," he said sullenly, "you can file a complaint." The way he said it implied it would be a pointless, bureaucratic exercise. He still didn't understand who he was dealing with. He assumed she was just another angry citizen whose complaint would end up in a file, investigated by a fellow officer, and ultimately dismissed. He was wrong. Ava took the slip of paper from Sergeant Corbin. She didn't say thank you. "I will also need a copy of the official police report for this incident," she stated, not as a request, but as a fact. "There is no report," Corbin said quickly. "No arrest was made. It was just a citizen interaction." "You are mistaken," Ava corrected him, her voice like ice. "A battery occurred. I was unlawfully detained. A report is required. And I will also be formally requesting every second of security camera footage from this area, including from that bank across the street, beginning 10 minutes before the incident until now. I trust your department will preserve that evidence." The final statement was a clear warning. She knew about evidence disappearing. She was putting him and the entire Chicago Police Department on notice. Corbin's face was now a mask of grim resignation. This was going to be bad. He finally turned to Holloway, who had been standing silently, watching his world crumble. "Holloway, you're on desk duty for the rest of your shift. Russo, write up a statement. I'll deal with both of you back at the precinct." He then turned and walked away without another word to Ava, a clear sign that the conversation, from his perspective, was over. Once he was gone, a kind of calm descended. Officer Russo, looking deeply ashamed, approached her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for his behavior." Ava looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Being sorry isn't enough, Officer Russo. You had a duty to intervene. You knew what he was doing was wrong from the very beginning, and you stood by and let it happen." Her words were not accusatory, but they were heavy with the weight of truth. Russo flinched and said nothing more. Ava finally stopped recording. She knelt down and began to carefully, methodically pack her belongings back into her briefcase. The lipstick, the perfume, the laptop, the portfolio. She placed the locket with her grandmother's picture inside with gentle care. Several of the women who had witnessed the event came forward and quietly helped her. Small acts of solidarity that spoke volumes. Within minutes, her dignity was, at least superficially, repacked. She stood up, took the names and numbers of the 14 people who had offered to be witnesses, and thanked each of them personally. Then, with her head held high, she turned and walked away from her work site. But she didn't get into her car and drive to her office. She had a new, more important destination in mind. She directed her driver to take her to a quiet cafe several blocks away. She ordered a black coffee, sat down at a secluded table, and for the next 2 hours, while the events were still painfully fresh in her mind, she worked. She opened a new document on her laptop and began to write. She documented everything, starting with the time on her watch when Holloway first approached her. She described his exact words, his condescending tone, the order in which he searched her belongings. She detailed the public humiliation, the moment he touched her, and Sergeant Corbin's dismissive attitude. She cross-referenced her written timeline with the timestamp on her phone's video recording, ensuring every detail was precise and irrefutable. It was a document born of cold, methodical fury, as detailed as one of her own architectural plans. While she wrote, she took care of her evidence. She uploaded the 12-minute video from her phone to 3 separate secure cloud servers. She then emailed the file to her personal email, her work email, and, most importantly, to the lead counsel of her firm's legal team, with the subject line, "Urgent, Evidence Preservation." She knew how easily a single file could be accidentally deleted. Hers would now exist in so many places it would be impossible to erase. She wasn't just going to file a complaint, she was going to build a fortress. The next morning, back in the sleek minimalist sanctuary of her office overlooking the Chicago River, Ava Thompson launched her first official salvo. She drafted a formal 25-page complaint against Officer Dean Holloway for assault, battery, and unlawful search, against Officer Russo for failure to intervene, and against Sergeant Miles Corbin for his negligent supervision and attempt to cover up the incident. She attached her meticulously written statement, a full transcript of the video, and the list of 14 witnesses. She made a deliberate choice. She did not mention her title, the name of her prestigious firm, or the Sterling Pavilion project. She filed the complaint simply as Ava Thompson, citizen. She wanted to test the system. She wanted to see how it treated an ordinary person without the weight of her professional success behind her. She wanted to see if their process was designed for justice or for deflection. She sent the package via certified mail to the CPD's Internal Affairs Division, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, COPA, the Chicago City Council, and the Illinois Attorney General's office. She covered all her bases. Then, she waited. 3 weeks passed in complete, deafening silence. Not a single phone call, not an email, not even a postcard acknowledging receipt. Ava wasn't surprised. She was, however, collecting more evidence, the evidence of institutional indifference. Finally, on the 22nd day, a thin, standard-sized envelope arrived at her home. It was from the Chicago Police Department, Office of Professional Standards. Her heart didn't race. She felt no anticipation. She knew with a weary certainty what would be inside. She opened it. The letter was a single page, a classic example of bureaucratic non-communication. It was a form letter. It began, "Dear Ms. Thompson," and thanked her for bringing her concerns to their attention. It went on to state that they take all complaints seriously and that an internal review of the matter had been conducted. And then, the final dismissive paragraph. "We have concluded our investigation, and the matter has been addressed internally in accordance with department policy. We consider this matter closed." That was it. No details of the investigation. No mention of what "addressed internally" meant. Was Holloway spoken to? Was he retrained? Was he given a written warning that would be buried in his file? Was he told to take a long lunch? The letter offered no transparency, no apology, and no justice. It was a slap in the face, a clear message that the blue wall of silence was firmly in place. They had circled the wagons to protect their own, just as she had predicted. They had investigated themselves and found themselves innocent of any serious wrongdoing. The complaint from Ava Thompson, citizen, had been duly filed and forgotten. Ava read the letter twice. Then a faint, dangerous smile touched her lips. This letter was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the last piece of the foundation she needed. It proved that the problem wasn't just one rogue officer. The problem was the entire system, a system that was designed to protect men like Dean Holloway. They had assumed she was powerless. They had assumed she would accept their dismissive letter and fade away. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She picked up her phone and made a call to the civil rights attorney who had given her his card on the street that day. "Elias," she said when he answered, "it's Ava Thompson. They did exactly what we thought they would. It's time. Schedule the press conference." They had just given a master architect the perfect justification to tear their house down to the studs. The press conference was held 2 days later in the sun-drenched atrium of the offices of Vance and Associates, the most feared and respected civil rights law firm in the Midwest. The room was packed. Every local news affiliate was there, along with reporters from national newspapers and cable news networks. They had been drawn by a vague but tantalizing press advisory about a major federal lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department, but they didn't know the full story. They were about to. At precisely 10 a.m., Ava Thompson walked to the podium. She was not dressed in the power blazer from the day of the incident. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant, cream-colored dress. Beside her stood Elias Vance, a formidable attorney with a silver mane and a reputation for dismantling corrupt institutions in court. The flashbulbs popped, creating a constellation of artificial stars in the glass-walled room. Ava stepped up to the microphone. A hush fell. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm and resonant. "My name is Ava Thompson. 3 weeks ago, while performing my professional duties on a public sidewalk, I was illegally targeted, detained, and assaulted by an officer of the Chicago Police Department. I was subjected to a humiliating public search of my personal belongings. I was physically grabbed. I was treated not as a citizen, but as a criminal. And when I filed a formal complaint, I was met with a dismissive form letter, effectively telling me that my civil rights do not matter." She paused, letting the words sink in. You could hear a pin drop. "They thought I was just another anonymous black woman they could harass and intimidate into silence. They were wrong." Elias Vance then stepped forward. "This morning," Vance announced, his voice booming with righteous anger, "we have filed a federal civil rights lawsuit on behalf of Ms. Thompson against Officer Dean Holloway, Officer Frank Russo, Sergeant Miles Corbin, and the City of Chicago. We are suing for unlawful search and seizure, battery, false imprisonment, and for maintaining a pattern and practice of racial discrimination that violates the 4th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution." Then came the moment that turned a local story into a national firestorm. Vance gestured to a large screen behind the podium. "And we have the evidence." The video began to play. It was Ava's crystal-clear cell phone footage, starting from the moment Holloway demanded she unlock her tablet. The reporters watched, mesmerized, as the entire confrontation unfolded. They heard Holloway's aggressive commands. They heard Ava's calm, legally precise responses. They saw his hand clamp down on her arm. They heard his damning, idiotic admission, "We'll figure that out when we get there." When the video ended, the room erupted in a frenzy of shouted questions. But Vance held up a hand for silence. "There's more," he said. It was then that a producer from a major news network, who had been doing frantic research on his phone, stood up. "Ms. Thompson," he called out, "can you confirm that you are Ava Thompson, the lead architect of the Sterling City Arts Pavilion?" Ava met his gaze and nodded. "I am." A collective gasp went through the room. This wasn't just any citizen. This was one of the city's most celebrated architectural minds, a woman shaping the future of their skyline, a professional with immense resources and a reputation for brilliance. The CPD hadn't just picked on the wrong person. They had picked a fight with one of the most powerful and respected women in the city. The story exploded. Within an hour, it was the lead item on every news website. The video went viral, racking up millions of views. The hashtags #JusticeForAva and #BadgeAbuse trended globally. The Chicago Police Department, which had felt so secure in its dismissive form letter, was suddenly facing a Category 5 hurricane of public outrage and media scrutiny. They had tried to bury a complaint, and in doing so, had unearthed a monster of a lawsuit that threatened to expose every secret they had. The press conference was a declaration of war, and Ava Thompson had just fired the first devastating shot. The lawsuit was a key, and Ava's legal team, led by the relentless Elias Vance, used it to unlock a door the Chicago Police Department had kept bolted shut for years: Officer Dean Holloway's complete and unredacted personnel file. The city's lawyers fought tooth and nail to keep it sealed, citing privacy concerns and officer protection. But the federal judge assigned to the case, a no-nonsense former prosecutor, took one look at Ava's video and granted the subpoena without hesitation. When the file arrived, a thick, dog-eared manila folder containing a decade's worth of Holloway's career, it was even worse than Vance had suspected. It wasn't just a file, it was a chronicle of bigotry, a detailed history of a predator who had been protected by his department at every turn. Pandora's box was open. Inside, they found not one, not two, but 14 prior civilian complaints filed against Officer Holloway for harassment, verbal abuse, and racial profiling. 14. All of them had been summarily dismissed, labeled unfounded, or had resulted in nothing more than a note for file, or a mandatory online course in cultural sensitivity that he likely clicked through in an afternoon. The stories in those complaints were chillingly similar to Ava's. They formed an undeniable mosaic of prejudice. There was the complaint from 3 years prior, filed by a renowned classical musician, a black man who was on his way to a performance at the Symphony Center. Holloway had stopped him, accused him of stealing the rare, expensive violin he was carrying, and detained him for over an hour, causing him to be late for his own concert. The complaint was dismissed after Holloway claimed the musician was acting suspiciously. 2 years before that, a complaint from a respected Latino doctor who was jogging in a wealthy neighborhood. Holloway had stopped him, frisked him, and questioned him for 20 minutes, implying he was a burglar casing the homes. The department's official response was that Holloway was diligently patrolling the area. There was a complaint from an Indian software engineer who Holloway had pulled over for a broken taillight that worked perfectly fine. He had then launched into a tirade, questioning the man's immigration status and asking how he could afford a car like this. The complaint was deemed unsubstantiated. Complaint after complaint told the same story. A black lawyer, a Hispanic graduate student, a Middle Eastern shop owner. The targets were always the same: people of color, particularly those who appeared successful or confident, who dared to exist in spaces Holloway felt they didn't belong. It was as if he had an allergy to minority success. He used his badge not to protect and serve, but to put people he deemed out of place back in theirs. The legal team was horrified and yet grimly satisfied. This was the holy grail of a civil rights lawsuit. It proved that Ava's experience wasn't an isolated incident or a simple misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a habit, a predictable outcome of a system that had been warned about a problem officer 14 times and had actively chosen to do nothing. Their inaction had made them complicit. Their dismissals of those prior complaints were not just administrative failings. They were the kindling that allowed the fire of Holloway's prejudice to burn unchecked, culminating in the assault on Ava Thompson. Elias Vance's team immediately began reaching out to every single one of the previous complainants. Their stories were about to be heard, not by a dismissive internal affairs officer, but by a federal jury. The news of Ava Thompson's lawsuit, combined with the leak of Holloway's complaint history to an investigative journalist, opened the floodgates. It was as if a dam of fear and futility had broken. People who had been harassed by Dean Holloway, who had suffered in silence believing no one would listen, suddenly found their voice. Ava's stand gave them courage. If a prominent architect could be treated this way, their own experiences were not only validated, but were now part of a larger, undeniable narrative. Elias Vance's office was inundated with calls. The initial 14 complaints were just the tip of the iceberg. Over the next few months, the legal team vetted and took sworn depositions from over 30 other individuals. 30 more people whose lives had been upended by a single officer's bigotry. The sheer volume was staggering, and their stories were heartbreaking. A young woman named Maria Sanchez recounted how Holloway had detained her on her way to a scholarship interview at the University of Chicago. He had gone through her backpack, making snide remarks about the books she was carrying and questioning her about her gang affiliations because she was wearing a hoodie with a neighborhood logo. He held her for so long that she missed the interview, an opportunity that could have changed her life. She had been too intimidated and ashamed to file a complaint at the time. Now she wept as she told her story to one of Vance's paralegals. A man named David Chen, a restaurant owner, described being pulled over by Holloway while driving his company's delivery van. Holloway had implied that Chen must be involved in human trafficking and had illegally searched the back of the van, ruining a large catering order in the process and costing Chen thousands of dollars. "He looked at me like I was garbage," Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. "He just wanted to hurt me." One of the most damning accounts came from a former CPD officer who had retired 2 years prior. He testified under oath that Holloway's targeting of minorities was an open secret among the staff at their precinct. "We called it Holloway's hunting ground," the former officer said. "Anytime we were assigned patrol with him in a nice neighborhood, You just waited to see which black or brown person he was going to pull aside to mess with. We all saw it. But who are you going to tell? Internal affairs? That's a joke. You report a fellow cop, you're a rat. Your career is over. It's that simple. This testimony was explosive. It moved the case beyond Holloway's individual actions and pointed directly to a corrupt and complicit culture within the department's leadership. They didn't just ignore the complaints. They fostered an environment where an officer like Holloway could flourish without fear of reprisal. The legal team compiled these stories into a devastating motion filed with the court, arguing that this overwhelming evidence of a pattern and practice of abuse should be admissible at trial. The city's lawyers fought it, claiming it would be prejudicial to Officer Holloway. The judge, after reading a summary of the 30 new depositions, disagreed. "Prejudicial," she said in a pretrial hearing, her voice dripping with scorn. "Counselor, what you call prejudicial, I call highly relevant. The motion is granted." The chorus of silenced voices was now poised to sing in a federal courtroom. The lawsuit was no longer just Ava Thompson versus Dean Holloway. It had become Ava Thompson and 44 other citizens versus a system that had wronged them all. The CPD had hoped to isolate Ava, to make it her word against a decorated officers. Instead, they were now facing an army of credible, sympathetic witnesses, creating a tidal wave of evidence that was about to crash down on Officer Dean Holloway and the department that had protected him for far too long. 11 months after that fateful morning on Sterling Row, the trial began. It was the most high-profile civil rights case the city had seen in decades. The federal courtroom was packed to capacity every single day. Outside, a forest of news cameras camped out on the courthouse steps. The prosecution, led by Elias Vance, had chosen to pursue a rare and aggressive legal strategy. In addition to the civil suit, they had presented their evidence to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which had convened a grand jury. The grand jury, after seeing the video and hearing from just a handful of the victims, had returned a criminal indictment against Dean Holloway for deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony. Holloway was now fighting not just for his job or for money, but for his freedom. On the third day of the trial, Ava Thompson was called to the stand. As she walked to the witness box, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was dressed in a conservative charcoal gray dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked composed, focused, and resolute. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the 12 members of the jury. Elias Vance began his direct examination. For 4 hours, he walked Ava through the events of that day. Her testimony was a masterclass in credibility. She never raised her voice, never overdramatized, never appeared vindictive. She simply and powerfully told the truth. She recounted the initial stop, the condescending questions, the moment Holloway dumped her personal items onto the bench. "How did that feel, Ms. Thompson?" Vance asked gently. Ava paused for a moment, her gaze still fixed on the jury. "It was profoundly humiliating," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It felt like I was being told that my privacy, my dignity didn't matter, that in that man's eyes I was not a person worthy of respect. I was just something for him to rummage through in public." She described how he'd tried to invade her private tablet, explaining the value of the intellectual property it contained, not in dollars, but in years of her life's work. Then Vance moved to the most critical moment. "Ms. Thompson, what happened when you began to record the encounter?" "Officer Holloway became enraged," Ava said. "He ordered me to stop. When I refused, he stepped toward me and grabbed my arm." "Can you describe the grab for the jury?" "It was hard. It was violent. It was meant to assert physical dominance," she said. "In that moment, I was afraid. I didn't know what he would do next. I didn't know how far he was willing to take it. He had a gun on his hip, and he had completely lost control of his emotions. Yes, I was afraid." Holloway, sitting at the defense table, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. When Vance finished, Holloway's defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. His strategy was clear: to paint Ava as an arrogant, entitled elitist who was oversensitive and disrespectful to law enforcement. "Ms. Thompson," he began, his tone oozing with false sympathy. "You're a very successful woman, aren't you?" "I've worked very hard," Ava replied. "And you're used to giving orders, not taking them, I imagine." "I'm used to collaborating with professionals in an environment of mutual respect," she countered smoothly. The lawyer tried to suggest that she had provoked Holloway. "So when the officer asked you what you were doing there, you could have been less confrontational, couldn't you?" Ava looked at him, then back at the jury. "I answered his question truthfully. I'm not sure how stating the fact that I am an architect can be considered confrontational, unless one believes that a black woman in that position is inherently a confrontation." A quiet, "ooh," rippled through the courtroom. The lawyer flushed, realizing his misstep. He had walked right into her trap. After 20 more minutes of fruitless questioning, he finally gave up. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Ava stepped down from the stand, she gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod to Elias Vance. Her part was done. She had laid the foundation. Now it was time to build the rest of the case on it. With Ava's powerful testimony as the bedrock, the prosecution constructed an impenetrable fortress of evidence. They played the bank's silent security camera footage, which clearly showed Holloway targeting Ava from across the street. They played Ava's cell phone video with the audio amplified, letting the jury hear his escalating hostility and her calm assertions of her rights. They heard his damning admission, "We'll figure that out when we get there." One by one, the witnesses from that day took the stand: the civil rights attorney, the journalism professor, the tourist. Then came the chorus of past victims. The prosecution called 3 of them: the musician, the doctor, and Maria Sanchez, the young woman who missed her scholarship interview. Their stories, all bearing the same signature of Holloway's prejudice, painted a picture of a man who used his badge as a weapon. The defense's case was weak, culminating in the disastrous decision to put Dean Holloway on the stand himself. On cross-examination, the federal prosecutor dismantled him. She replayed the video, forcing him to explain why a calm, unarmed woman constituted a threat. "She was challenging my authority," he finally spat out, the anger he'd shown on the street flaring up again in the courtroom. It was a confession. His actions had nothing to do with security. It was about his authority being challenged by a black woman who refused to be subservient. The closing arguments were a formality. Elias Vance delivered a passionate appeal to the jury's sense of justice. "This is not just about money," he concluded. "This is about accountability. It's about sending a message that will be heard in every police precinct in this country. A message that says you are not above the law. You work for us, and we will not tolerate your prejudice." The jury filed out. For a case that had lasted nearly 2 weeks, their deliberation was stunningly brief. They were gone for just under 4 hours. When they returned, Dean Holloway was told to rise. He stood, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen. The jury foreman handed the verdict forms to the clerk. "In the civil matter of Thompson versus the City of Chicago," the clerk read, "on all counts, unlawful search, battery, false imprisonment, and maintaining a pattern of discrimination, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Ava Thompson." They awarded her $1 million in compensatory damages and a staggering $20 million in punitive damages against the city. Then came the criminal verdict. In the case of the United States versus Dean Holloway, on the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Holloway's knees seemed to buckle. He was now a convicted felon. At his sentencing a week later, the judge was unsparing. "Mr. Holloway, you disgraced your badge and betrayed the public's trust. This court cannot and will not tolerate such a gross abuse of power. It is the sentence of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term of 10 years. As the U.S. Marshals moved in to place him in handcuffs, there was one final, breathtaking twist. Elias Vance stood and addressed the court regarding the punitive damages. "Your Honor," he announced, "my client, Ms. Thompson, has instructed that the entirety of the $20 million in punitive damages is to be directed into a trust. This trust will fund a new citywide initiative providing free legal aid to victims of police misconduct and will establish a permanent, independent, civilian-led police oversight board. The courtroom murmured, but the judge wasn't finished. She looked directly at the CPD chief. "Chief," she said, "it is my understanding that your department was approached 3 years ago by a philanthropic group offering to fund a new community outreach and de-escalation training center pro bono. Your department declined, citing a lack of suitable space." The chief looked confused. "That sounds vaguely familiar, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward. "Let the record show that the lead architect who designed that community center and offered to oversee its construction free of charge as a gift to the city was the plaintiff in this case, Ms. Ava Thompson." A collective gasp filled the room. The police chief's face went from pale to ghostly white. They had rejected her offer to help them build bridges, so she had been forced to teach them a lesson another way, a much, much harder way. The gavel fell one last time, but the sound echoed with the weight of a lesson that would never be forgotten. The storm had passed. In the quiet aftermath, what remained was the wreckage and the slow, arduous task of rebuilding. Dean Holloway was gone, his life reduced to a number in the federal prison system. One has to wonder what led a man like him down this path. Perhaps it was insecurity. Perhaps seeing a black woman like Ava, so composed, so successful, holding a power in her intellect that he felt he lacked in his character, triggered a deep-seated resentment. His badge was the only thing that made him feel superior, and when she didn't immediately bow to its authority, his entire sense of self was threatened. His aggression wasn't an act of policing. It was an act of desperation from a man terrified of his own insignificance. Could things have been different? What if Officer Russo had intervened sooner, more forcefully? Almost certainly. His silence was a form of consent, a quiet endorsement of his partner's abuse. What if the department had taken those first 14 complaints seriously? Absolutely. Holloway's actions were the predictable, tragic result of a system that chose convenience over accountability time and time again. And what if Ava hadn't been a renowned architect with the resources to fight back? The sad truth is, her story might have ended like all the others, with a complaint filed away in a dusty cabinet, a forgotten footnote in a broken system. It was her power that allowed her to turn a moment of private humiliation into a movement for public justice. The ultimate message of this story isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. It reminds us that standing up is not just a right, but a necessity, and that a single voice, armed with truth and courage, can be more powerful than an entire institution that has lost its way. Ava Thompson didn't just win a lawsuit. She forced a reckoning and used her victory not to enrich herself, but to build a better, more just system for everyone who would come after her. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What part of Ava's journey inspired you the most? And have you ever seen a situation where one person's courage made a real difference? Share your story in the comments below. Your engagement helps us keep telling stories that matter.